The 44th edition of the Durban International Film Festival is expected to take place from the 20th of July. So far, the festival has received over 3,300 films from 137 countries. We're now joined by Andrea Borges, Durban Film Festival Director, and Milisuthando Bongela, a film director. Big thank you to both our guests for your time this afternoon. Milisuthando, let's start with you and your offering. If you could please introduce it to our viewers.
Thank you very much. My name is Milisuthando Bongela, and I'm from East London in the Eastern Cape. And I'm the director and the writer of a feature documentary self-titled Milisuthando, which is a coming-of-age personal essay. It's a feature documentary, kind of artistic, very experimental, that looks at what it meant to grow up in South Africa after apartheid and as somebody who came from a Bantustan. And so it's a deep dive into what it means to have come from a Bantustan and how apartheid functioned quite differently there in the Transkei, and then all the way into the new South Africa and what it meant to be little black children going into white schools in the early 1990s. And it's a deep meditation on race relations in the country, intimacy, and what potential modalities of healing and self-reclamation are possible using indigenous knowledge systems, looking to Isintu, Nobuntu as a way of kind of healing from our past and fashioning a future for ourselves. So it's my first feature film. Yeah.
Congratulations. Let's expand on that, especially when you mention the word Bantustan, and maybe use this as a teaching moment for those who do not know what that is and the rules that were prescribed more so for women.
So Bantustans were an invention of the apartheid regime. So as part of this idea of that all the races and ethnic groups must be separate, the apartheid regime basically balkanized the country and broke it up into different ethnic regions. And the idea was to create 9 or 10 different countries in this current South Africa that we have. So South Africa would have been the 10th country, but there would be 9 independent nations that were supposed to be self-governing, but they were funded by the apartheid regime. And the whole idea was to propagate this notion that all the races should be separated. And they had leaders within the Bantustans, and I come from the first Bantustan, the Transkei, which was founded in 1976, where I kind of grew up in a place that it was called the Republic of Transkei, and it was a mini state inside of itself, but it wasn't recognized by the rest of the world. It was only recognized by the South African government and Israel, I think, and Taiwan at a later point. But essentially, apartheid didn't function the same way there. In fact, I didn't know that there was such a thing as apartheid because I grew up in an all-black environment where the police were black, the doctors were black. My parents had, briefcase carrying type jobs, and I had no idea that there was anything wrong with me as a black person, or that there were any people that didn't like us. There were white people, but they never featured in the kind of ways that you see historically represented. And so the film kind of looks at, really tries to understand what apartheid was beyond what we know and understand, beyond the images of what we know about what was happening in the townships and the brutal apartheid that we know now. I'm kind of psychologically trying to understand what created the Transkei, and then Bophuthatswana after that, and Venda after that, and Ciskei after that, and what was called at the time these TBV states, which had a semi-independence. And where blackness was kind of coalesced with our ethnic cultures and our identities. So my mother, for instance, when I asked her about the 76 riots and so on, so she said, yes, things were so bad in South Africa. We read about them in the newspapers, and I was like, but it is South Africa. And there was always this confusion about are the Bantustans independent or are they not independent? And so I'm looking at the identity of what it meant to have come from that place and to only discover apartheid in 1994 when it was over, that there was this thing in the system. Because we grew up in such a sheltered world, and it was there was a lot of propaganda made by the apartheid regime to kind of fulfill this idea of separate development. Yeah, Bantustans were very, very complex, but also interesting, and I think worth revisiting as South Africans, because whenever people watch the film, we just had screenings now during the Encounters Film Festival, and people from Bophuthatswana came up to me and they were like, yay, I grew up in this place, and I do remember that actually we also thought our lives were fine until things ended in '94, and then we were introduced to the rest of the country. And so it's a probe, you know. I know that it's contentious, and we hardly ever hear from middle-class people in the homeland. I had a middle-class upbringing. There were, of course, many problems with them. There were corrupt governments. There were very, very many poor people. I don't think that the systems worked, but as somebody who, you know, grew up in a middle-class setting inside apartheid, I'm interested in how this all happened.
Yeah. When you speak of the theme of healing, I can sense that this was somewhat cathartic for you. There are people who grew up in Bantustans who were not so sheltered. Recently had a conversation with someone who spoke about the family dynamics between the relationship between themselves and their mother, because at the time, if you were not married, then you would not keep the children as a woman, and that fractured their relationship for the rest of their lives. And so when you take a look at some of the themes of healing, perhaps you can tell our viewers who are familiar, right, with that environment, but who would not necessarily have been protected, what other areas of healing you get into.
You know, what I think is really interesting and worth really studying and investigating about these Bantustans and revisiting, especially, you know, with people who lived in them and who somehow, it's almost like these countries disappeared in 1994 when they were all reintegrated into South Africa. Is that what were the laws in those particular places? Because I'm not aware of that law where mothers were separated from their children. I'm not sure which Bantustan the person was in, but for instance, these are kinds of things that should be in the public knowledge and should be commonplace, but I don't think that they are. Like in my own family, I know that there were, you know, women who had children. Some of them were separated by marriage, as in married off to other people, but there were others who did keep their children. So I'm not exactly sure how that worked. And the healing that I'm looking at is more kind of looking at the psychic wound that apartheid caused in us as people, whether we were white or black or colored or Indian, or so-called colored. And what it means for us to revisit our history 30 years down the line. Apartheid may be over in terms of the laws, but obviously the legacies are still very much there in how we understand ourselves. There are superiority complexes and inferiority complexes that are constantly bumping up against each other. And for me, the thing that I was really interested in was how do I reclaim a sense of self that that can kind of imagine, because I want to live here for the rest of my life, you know, what world would my children be coming into? Are they going to be learning the same thing about their blackness as, say, my mom was or I was? And what do we do with these histories that we've inherited within these now intimate spaces that we share with each other across race and across difference? And for me, I had to go back into my own personal history to say, when was the first place that I learned to hate myself as a black person? And that was at my Model C school in 1992, 93, 94. That's when I started having a problem with what it meant to be black. And then I said, wait a minute, where did I grow up that I didn't have this sense of distance from who I am? And when I was like, oh, I grew up in a homeland where everybody spoke Xhosa, and our cartoons were in Xhosa, and there was such affirmation without even knowing it, because of the fact, and of course, the problems weren't necessarily racialized. Like if the people were corrupt, you'd be like, oh yes, our leaders who are all Xhosa are corrupt, or you know, the things weren't as racialized as they then later became in my life. And for me, it's about trying to figure out what does it mean to be human in the context of race. And that's more the healing I'm putting forth, but using indigenous knowledge systems that if somebody entering with a different type of problem, for instance, spirituality, and how many people in the country were forced to become Christians under these systems.
I do apologize. I'm so sorry, because we literally have a minute or a couple of seconds to the end of the show. A big thank you and a big congratulations to you, Milisuthando Bongela, as a film director. And that's it from myself.